Today, we're talking about the paper, The Ethics of Belief by William Kingdom Clifford. Clifford is more well-known these days as a mathematician. His work on Clifford algebras and geometric algebra has been highly influential, but he also published several influential philosophical works, including this one, even though he died at a very young age, at the age of 33. So this paper actually came out at around the time he died. There are some places in which this paper has the feeling of a scientist coming in to tell philosophers that they're doing everything all wrong, but you can judge for yourself after hearing more of it. Okay, so in this paper, The Ethics of Belief, he's talking about when it is that we have a duty to believe things or a duty not to believe things. And this is supposed to generalize the idea of ethics that we have for when you have a duty to do things or not to do things. So section 1, the duty of inquiry. A ship owner was about to send to sea an emigrant ship. He knew that she was old and not over well built at the first, that she had seen many seas and climes and often had needed repairs. Doubts had been suggested to him that possibly she was not seaworthy. These doubts preyed upon his mind and made him unhappy. He thought that perhaps he ought to have her thoroughly overhauled and refitted, even though this should put him to great expense. Before the ship sailed, however, he succeeded in overcoming these melancholy reflections. He said to himself that she had gone safely through so many voyages and weathered so many storms that it was idle to suppose she would not come safely home from this trip also. He would put his trust in Providence, which could hardly fail to protect all these unhappy families that were leaving their fatherland to seek for better times elsewhere. He would dismiss from his mind all ungenerous suspicions about the honesty of builders and contractors. In such ways, he acquired a sincere and comfortable conviction that his vessel was thoroughly safe and seaworthy. He watched her departure with a light heart and benevolent wishes for the success of the exiles in their strange new home that was to be. And he got his insurance money when she went down in mid-ocean and told no tales. What shall we say of him? Surely this, that he was verily guilty of the death of those men. It is admitted that he did sincerely believe in the soundness of his ship, but the sincerity of his conviction can in no wise help him, because he had no right to believe on such evidence as was before him. He had acquired his belief not by honestly earning it in patient investigation, but by stifling his doubts. And although in the end he may have felt so sure about it that he could not think otherwise, yet inasmuch as he had knowingly and willingly worked himself into that frame of mind, he must be held responsible for it. So here I think he's giving us the first argument that there is a duty to pay attention to your evidence when you believe things. And the idea is that this belief is leading to an action that is causing real world consequences for people. And if the belief can lead to that consequence, then the belief, he thinks, is just as worthy of praise or blame as any other sort of action that could end up with these sorts of consequences for people. And he's noting in this version of the story, the person had reason to doubt that the ship was safe, but he ignored that reason or hid that reason and made himself not doubt. And he thinks that is a violation of our duty. And he's going to then discuss how can we generalize this. So let us alter the case a little and suppose that the ship was not unsound after all, that she made her voyage safely and many others after it. Will that diminish the guilt of her owner? Not one jot. When an action is once done, it is right or wrong forever. No accidental failure of its good or evil fruits can possibly alter that. The man would not have been innocent, he would only have been not found out. The question of right or wrong has to do with the origin of his belief, not the matter of it. Not what it was, but how he got it. Not whether it turned out to be true or false, but whether he had a right to believe on such evidence as was before him. So I think the idea here is he's saying, even if the belief turns out to be true, even if the ship is safe, he thinks the person is just as guilty of a wrong belief if he believed it against the evidence in this way. And I think the idea is supposed to be just like someone who drives while drunk is guilty, whether or not they actually hit someone and hurt someone, because they knowingly ran that risk. Here, the person is guilty of believing something without evidence because he knowingly ran the risk of sending people to their deaths. And the fact that he was lucky and no one actually did die, Clifford is saying that can't be part of the evaluation. So he's assuming that the way we evaluate actions has to be not based on how they turn out, but based on what went into them. And he's saying the same thing about belief. And so he thinks we have to evaluate the ethics of belief by looking at what went into the belief. What is the evidence on which it's based? So now here he's going to give a second example. There was once an island in which some of the inhabitants professed a religion teaching neither the doctrine of original sin nor that of eternal punishment. A suspicion got abroad that the professors of this religion had made use of unfair means to get their doctrines taught to children. They were accused of wresting the laws of their country in such a way as to remove children from the care of their natural and legal guardians, and even of stealing them away and keeping them concealed from their friends and relations. A certain number of men formed themselves into a society for the purpose of agitating the public about this matter. They published grave accusations against individual citizens of the highest position and character, and did all in their power to injure these citizens in the exercise of their professions. So great was the noise they made that a commission was appointed to investigate the facts. But after the commission had carefully inquired into all the evidence that could be got, it appeared that the accused were innocent. Not only had they been accused on insufficient evidence, but the evidence of their innocence was such as the agitators might easily have obtained if they had attempted a fair inquiry. After these disclosures, the inhabitants of that country looked upon the members of the agitating society not only as persons whose judgment was to be distrusted, but also as no longer to be counted honorable men. For although they had sincerely and conscientiously believed in the charges they had made, yet they had no right to believe on such evidence as was before them. Their sincere convictions, instead of being honestly earned by patient inquiring, were stolen by listening to the voice of prejudice and passion. And I think here it's useful to pause and review what exactly this case is. There's some minority religion. There's people who believe that the members of this minority religion are kidnapping children and doing other things. And so they form a committee to investigate and they try to persecute the members of this minority religion. And then it turns out, not only is this minority religion not guilty, but in fact, the people who were accusing them not only had no evidence, but would have easily turned up evidence that they were just totally wrong, that this minority religion was not a problem. And so here he's saying the people who believe that the minority religion is causing problems, if they believe it without evidence, then they are guilty of this believing what they have no right to believe. Okay, now he says, let us vary this case also, and suppose, other things remaining as before, that a still more accurate investigation proved the accused to have been really guilty. Would this make any difference in the guilt of the accusers? So here he's saying, imagine that some people just believe some prejudice against a minority religion. It turns out that their prejudices are right, but they had no evidence, no reason to believe this. And he's asking, in this case, does the fact that they're right make any difference in the guilt of their belief? And he says, clearly not. The question is not whether their belief was true or false, but whether they entertained it on wrong grounds. So here he's pointing out the way you evaluate someone, he thinks, is based on what they're basing their actions and their belief on, not whether their actions or their belief actually in the end lead to a good outcome, but rather what it's based on. They would no doubt say, now you see that we were right after all. Next time, perhaps you will believe us. And they might be believed, but they would not thereby become honorable men. They would not be innocent. They would only be not found out. Every one of them, if he chose to examine himself in foro conscientiae, would know that he had acquired and nourished a belief when he had no right to believe on such evidence as was before him. And therein, he would know that he had done a wrong thing. So this is basically the central idea, and the rest of the paper is elaborating on this and saying, what does it take to be justified, to be right in our beliefs? It may be said, here he's considering an objection. It may be said, however, that in both of these supposed cases, it is not the belief which is judged to be wrong, but the action following upon it. The ship owner might say, I am perfectly certain that my ship is sound, but still I feel it my duty to have her examined before trusting the lives of so many people to her. And it might be said to the agitator, however convinced you were of the justice of your cause and the truth of your convictions, you ought not to have made a public attack upon any man's character until you had examined the evidence on both sides with the utmost patience and care. In the first place, let us admit that, so far as it goes, this view of the case is right and necessary. Right, because even when a man's belief is so fixed that he cannot think otherwise, he still has a choice in regard to the action suggested by it, and so cannot escape the duty of investigating on the ground of the strength of his convictions. And necessary, because those who are not yet capable of controlling their feelings and thoughts must have a plain rule dealing with overt acts. So here he's conceding the idea to this objection that we should be judging the acts, but he wants to say that's not enough. We do have to judge the belief as well. The belief itself, he thinks, is wrong, morally wrong. It is a violation of our duty to believe these things, even if we weren't going to act on it. So he says, this being premised as necessary, that is, even if we concede that you do have to judge the acts as well as the beliefs, it becomes clear that it is not sufficient, and our previous judgment, that is the judgment that the belief is wrong, is required to supplement it. For it is not possible so to sever the belief from the action it suggests as to condemn the one without condemning the other. So I think here he's saying, you can't really separate belief and action. So you can't evaluate the actions without evaluating the beliefs that lead to it. Maybe that's right. But that's his claim. No man holding a strong belief on one side of a question, or even wishing to hold a belief on one side, can investigate it with such fairness and completeness as if he were really in doubt and unbiased, so that the existence of a belief not founded on fair inquiry unfits a man for the performance of this necessary duty. So I think he's saying, even if we primarily judge people on the basis of their action, if someone believes with insufficient evidence, then they're not going to be in a good position to control their actions well. And so that's another reason to condemn them for their beliefs. And now he says, nor is it that truly a belief at all, which has not some influence upon the actions of him who holds it. So here he's saying, it's impossible to fully separate your beliefs from your actions. And so therefore, that's another reason to judge the beliefs and not just the actions. He who truly believes that which prompts him to an action has looked upon the action to lust after it. He has committed it already in his heart. You might have noticed Clifford uses a lot of very flowery language. I don't know if that was actually typical of philosophers of the time, or if this is what he as a mathematician thought might be typical of philosophers of the time, or if it's just his personal style. But I think sometimes it's helpful to pause and dig out from the flowery language. And this part seems a bit extreme to me to say that just by believing something, you're already anticipating and desiring the actions that follow from that belief. And I think there's a question, what exactly is this connection between belief and action? But at any rate, given what Clifford thinks it is, it's appropriate to judge the belief and not just the action. And now he says, here's some more reasons why we should judge beliefs. If a belief is not realized immediately in open deeds, it is stored up for the guidance of the future. It goes to make a part of that aggregate of beliefs, which is the link between sensation and action at every moment of all our lives, and which is so organized and compacted together that no part of it can be isolated from the rest, but every new addition modifies the structure of the whole. So that is, he's saying, anything you believe is part of your overall worldview and will shape your actions. Therefore, everything you believe is subject to judgment, and everything you believe is subject to this duty of believing only in line with the evidence. No real belief, however trifling and fragmentary it may seem, is ever truly insignificant. It prepares us to receive more of its like, confirms those which resembled it before, and weakens others. And so gradually it lays a stealthy train in our inmost thoughts, which may someday explode into overt action and leave its stamp upon our character forever. Again, he's being very flowery here. I'm not sure that I feel this, I would approve of this language if we're thinking about like a mathematical belief. Is it appropriate to believe that the 11th digit of pi is 7 without any evidence? Is that going to prepare us to do these sorts of things? We'll see. He says, and no one man's belief is in any case a private matter which concerns himself alone. So here's a new argument for why it's wrong to believe things without evidence. It's not just about yourself, it's about other people. Our lives are guided by that general conception of the course of things, which has been created by society for social purposes. Our words, our phrases, our forms and processes and modes of thought are common property, fashioned and perfected from age to age, an heirloom which every succeeding generation inherits as a precious deposit and a sacred trust to be handed on to the next one, not unchanged, but enlarged and purified, with some clear marks of its proper handiwork. Into this, for good or ill, is woven every belief of every man who has speech of his fellows, an awful privilege and an awful responsibility that we should help create the world in which posterity will live. So he's saying, anytime you believe something, as long as you ever talk to other people, your belief is shaping what other people believe and shaping what future generations believe. And if you were to put something that wasn't properly justified into this common pool of thoughts, then he thinks that would also be a reason to condemn you for believing something inappropriately. In the two supposed cases which have been considered, it has been judged wrong to believe on insufficient evidence, or to nourish belief by suppressing doubts and avoiding investigation. The reason of this judgment is not far to seek. It is that in both these cases, the belief held by one man was of great importance to other men. But forasmuch as no belief held by one man, however seemingly trivial the belief, and however obscure the believer, is ever actually insignificant or without its effect on the fate of mankind, we have no choice but to extend our judgment to all cases of belief, whatever. So that is, he's saying, it's not just the things that are obviously significant to the lives of others. Every belief you have, everything you ever think, if you ever believe anything based on insufficient evidence, you are guilty of this same violation of our duty. Belief, that sacred faculty which prompts the decisions of our will and knits into harmonious working all the compacted energies of our being, is ours not for ourselves, but for humanity. It is rightly used on truths which have been established by long experience and waiting toil, and which have stood in the fierce light of free and fearless questioning. Then it helps to bind men together and to strengthen and direct their common action. It, belief, is desecrated when given to unproved and unquestioned statements for the solace and private pleasure of the believer, to add a tinsel splendor to the plain straight road of our life and display a bright mirage beyond it, or even to drown the common sorrows of our kind by a self-deception which allows them not only to cast down, but also to degrade us. Whoso would deserve well of his fellows in this matter will guard the purity of his belief with a very fanaticism of jealous care, lest at any time it should rest on an unworthy object and catch a stain which can never be wiped away. Again, he's being very flowery here, but saying basically the same point. Anything you believe is part of the overall pattern of belief of the world, and if you ever believe anything on insufficient evidence, you are dishonoring this ability that we have, the ability to judge beliefs. It is not only the leader of men, statesman, philosopher, or poet that owes this bounden duty to mankind. And now here we see a little bit of Clifford's classism and racism and sexism, which comes back at several points throughout the paper. Every rustic who delivers in the village alehouse his slow, infrequent sentences may help to kill or keep alive the fatal superstitions which clog his race. Every hard-worked wife of an artisan may transmit to her children beliefs which shall knit society together or rend it in pieces. No simplicity of mind, no obscurity of station can escape the universal duty of questioning all that we believe. So he's saying everyone needs to pay attention to what you believe. It's not just the people who are in public office, not just the people who are in the media who talk to the wide general public. We all talk to each other and we all shape each other's beliefs. And no matter who you are, you have a duty, he says, to believe only what the evidence supports. It is true that this duty is a hard one, and the doubt which comes out of it is often a very bitter thing. It leaves us bare and powerless where we thought that we were safe and strong. To know all about anything is to know how to deal with it under all circumstances. We feel much happier and more secure when we think we know precisely what to do, no matter what happens, than when we have lost our way and do not know where to turn. And if we have supposed ourselves to know all about anything and to be capable of doing what is fit in regard to it, we naturally do not like to find that we are really ignorant and powerless, that we have to begin again at the beginning and try to learn what the thing is and how it is to be dealt with, if indeed anything can be learned about it. It is the sense of power attached to a sense of knowledge that makes men desirous of believing and afraid of doubting. So here he's trying to explain, why is it that we ever believe things on insufficient evidence? It's because when we know things, we can work skillfully and securely and happily and safely. And so we like to fool ourselves into thinking that we know things, even when we don't. And he's saying, if you don't really have sufficient evidence, you should doubt. And that doubting makes us unhappy, but you should do it anyway. That's your duty to mankind, not just to avoid harming people directly, but also to avoid corrupting the shared store of beliefs, which might lead someone else to act harmfully, and also to avoid tarnishing your own habits and faculties. This sense of power is the highest and best of pleasures when the belief on which it is founded is a true belief and has been fairly earned by investigation. For then we may justly feel that it is common property and holds good for others as well as for ourselves. So that is, if you believe something and it's well supported, then you can share that. That is communal property. It's not just something in your head. It's good for everyone. There's objectivity. He says, then we may be glad, not that I have learned secrets by which I am safer and stronger, but that we men have got mastery over more of the world, and we shall be strong, not for ourselves, but in the name of man and his strength. So here it's a bit of the sort of archaic 19th century use of man as this generic for humans, but the idea is he thinks knowledge is a good, not because it helps me as an individual, but because knowledge is communal property. It's something that we all share in that helps make the world a better place. But if the belief has been accepted on insufficient evidence, the pleasure is a stolen one. Not only does it deceive ourselves by giving us a sense of power which we do not really possess, but it is sinful because it is stolen in defiance of our duty to mankind. That duty is to guard ourselves from such beliefs as from a pestilence, which may shortly master our own body and then spread to the rest of town. So that is, believing on insufficient evidence is like coming down with a contagion and spreading it to other people. Anything you believe can be spread. You should believe things, therefore, that are good, not that are believed in spite of any lack of evidence. What would be thought of one who, for the sake of a sweet fruit, should deliberately run the risk of bringing a plague upon his family and his neighbors? There may be a little bit of current events in there, even though this was written 140 years ago. As in other such cases, it is not the risk only which has to be considered. For a bad action is always bad at the time when it is done, no matter what happens afterwards. So here he's saying it's not just the fact that you have a bad outcome from a belief that makes the belief bad. The belief itself is bad if it's unjustified, even if nothing bad happens directly as a result. Every time we let ourselves believe for unworthy reasons, we weaken our powers of self-control, of doubting, of judicially and fairly weighing evidence. We all suffer severely enough from the maintenance and support of false beliefs and the fatally wrong actions which they lead to, and the evil born when one such belief is entertained is great and wide. But a greater and wider evil arises when the credulous character is maintained and supported, when a habit of believing for unworthy reasons is fostered and made permanent. So that is, he's saying, it's really not just the belief itself, the harms from the belief itself, it's the fact that developing a habit of believing wrongly is going to harm you later, even if this belief doesn't harm you. If I steal money from any person, there may be no harm done by the mere transfer of possession. He may not feel the loss, or it may even prevent him from using the money badly. But I cannot help doing this great wrong toward man, that I make myself dishonest. What hurts society is not that it should lose its property, but that it should become a den of thieves, for then it must cease to be society. This is why we ought not to do evil that good may come. For at any rate, this great evil has come, that we have done evil and are made wicked thereby. So here, I think he's objecting to certain theories of ethics. Some ethical theories say that what matters is, are you bringing about good ends in the end? And he's saying, no, it's not that sort of ethical theory. This is an ethical theory that says there are certain acts that are just wrong, and you shouldn't do them, even if doing them would apparently help people, because doing them would develop bad habits in yourself that would lead you to harm people in the future, even if this instance isn't going to harm people. So here, I think, if you're familiar with discussions of ethical theory, he's criticizing a purely act consequentialist view and endorsing something like a deontological or a virtue ethics view. That is, he's saying how we should evaluate our acts is based on what kind of acts they are and what habits they lead us to, not whether they directly lead to good or ill. He does think the fact that false beliefs lead to harm is the fundamental reason why false beliefs are generally bad, but believing against the evidence is bad because it's a bad habit that will lead to these things, and it's a bad habit even if on a particular occasion it happens not to harm you. In like manner, if I let myself believe anything on insufficient evidence, there may be no great harm done by this mere belief. It may be true after all, or I may never have occasion to exhibit it in outward acts. But I cannot help doing this great wrong towards man, that I make myself credulous. The danger to society is not merely that it should believe wrong things, though that is great enough, but that it should become credulous and lose the habit of testing things and inquiring into them, for then it must sink back into savagery. So he seems to be thinking that all of humanity's progress is due to the fact that we have developed hard-won habits of investigating and checking things. And if we don't do this every single time we believe things, then we develop bad habits and lapse back into savagery, as he calls it. The harm which is done by credulity in a man is not confined to the fostering of a credulous character in others and consequent support of false beliefs. Habitual want of care about what I believe leads to habitual want of care in others about the truth of what is told to me. Men speak the truth to one another when each reveres the truth in his own mind and in the other's mind. But how shall my friend revere the truth in my mind when I myself am careless about it, when I believe things because I want to believe them and because they are comforting and pleasant? Will he not learn to cry peace to me when there is no peace? By such a course, I shall surround myself with a thick atmosphere of falsehood and fraud, and in that I must live. It may matter little to me in my cloud castle of sweet illusions and darling lies, but it matters much to man that I have made my neighbors ready to deceive. The credulous man is father to the liar and the cheat. He lives in the bosom of this, his family, and it is no marvel if he should become even as they are. So closely are our duties knit together that whoso shall keep the whole law, yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. That is, he's saying, if you ever believe things on insufficient evidence, then you are basically telling everyone else that they might as well lie to you. And once they start lying to you, they'll start lying to everyone. And so just by even once believing something on insufficient evidence, you are contributing to the downfall of society. To sum up, it is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. This is the catchphrase of this paper. This is the one line that everyone always quotes. It is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. If a man, holding a belief which he was taught in childhood or persuaded of afterwards, keeps down and pushes away any doubts which arise about it in his mind, purposely avoids the reading of books and the company of men that call in question or discuss it, and regards as impious those questions which cannot easily be asked without disturbing it, the life of that man is one long sin against mankind. If this judgment seems harsh when applied to those simple souls who have never known better, who have been brought up from the cradle with a horror of doubt and taught that their eternal welfare depends on what they believe, then it leads to the very serious question, who hath made Israel to sin? So he's saying, if we're really going to criticize everyone, including everyone who's been taught their whole life that they should believe things unquestioningly, then let's think, who made everyone do this? Who are the people that we should blame? It may be permitted me to fortify this judgment with the sentence of Milton. A man may be a heretic in the truth, and if he believes things only because his pastor says so, or the assembly so determined, without knowing other reason, though his belief be true, yet the very truth he holds becomes his heresy. So that is, he's saying, if you believe something just because other people believe it and you don't check it or you test it or think about it, then even if what you believe is right, you're still a heretic of a sort. You're believing things improperly if you believe it just because other people do and not for any particularly good reason. He's going to talk a bit later about when we should believe what other people tell us. And with this famous aphorism of Coleridge, he who begins by loving Christianity better than truth will proceed by loving his own sect or church better than Christianity, and end in loving himself better than all. So I think here's a question. I think Clifford is arguing against religion in various ways, but he's at least claiming to still endorse Christianity. But I think his point is, if you want to endorse Christianity, you should endorse it as truth, and you shouldn't avoid doubts just because you think those doubts might lead you to think that your belief is false. If your belief is false, you should want to believe the truth, he thinks, because if you insist on believing Christianity, even if you're afraid it might be false, then you're eventually going to give up on Christianity as a whole and believe just your own particular sect and end up just believing anything that you personally feel like. You have to be committed to the truth in your belief if that belief is going to be valuable, he thinks. Inquiry into the evidence of a doctrine is not to be made once for all and then taken as finally settled. It is never lawful to stifle a doubt, for either it can be honestly answered by means of the inquiry already made, or else it proves that the inquiry was not complete. So that is, anyone who questions anything, you should always either be able to have an answer for them or be willing to entertain the doubts that they're raising, because otherwise you're believing something on insufficient evidence. But, says one, I'm a busy man. I have no time for the long course of study which would be necessary to make me in any degree a competent judge of certain questions, or even able to understand the nature of the arguments. Then he should have no time to believe. So I think Clifford is saying, believing is an extremely deep duty, and we have a duty to do it right. And if you can't do it right, then it's better to just not believe anything about those matters and leave that to other people. So anything that you yourself don't have evidence for, he's saying you should just suspend your judgment, withhold judgment, let other people believe that. Now, section 2, he's going to get into this broader question. When should you trust other people? When should you believe what they tell you? The weight of authority. Are we then to become universal skeptics, doubting everything, afraid always to put one foot before the other until we have personally tested the firmness of the road? Are we to deprive ourselves of the help and guidance of that vast body of knowledge which is daily growing upon the world, because neither we nor any other one person can possibly test 100th part of it by immediate experiment or observation, and because it would not be completely proved if we did? Shall we steal and tell lies because we have had no personal experience wide enough to justify the belief that it is wrong to do so? So here's the worry. Some people think this sort of skepticism is going to lead to all sorts of problems because there's too much knowledge in the world for us to test it all. And if we insist on not believing anything until we've tested it, well, why should I believe morality? How will I test that? And so he says, there is no practical danger that such consequences will ever follow from scrupulous care and self-control in the matter of belief. Those men who have most nearly done their duty in this respect have found that certain great principles, and those most fitted for the guidance of life, have stood out more and more clearly in proportion to the care and honesty with which they were tested, and have acquired in this way a practical certainty. The beliefs about right and wrong which guide our actions in dealing with men in society, and the beliefs about physical nature which guide our actions in dealing with animate and inanimate bodies, these never suffer from investigation. They can take care of themselves without being propped up by acts of faith, the clamor of paid advocates, or the suppression of contrary evidence. So here he's claiming, you don't have to worry about skepticism. You can actually test your moral beliefs and your ordinary beliefs about the physical world and about other people and about animals. These things, he thinks, can be justified. We can get sufficient evidence for them. Moreover, there are many cases in which it is our duty to act upon probabilities, although the evidence is not such as to justify present belief, because it is precisely by such action and by observation of its fruits that evidence is got which may justify future belief. So that is, he's saying, there's plenty of cases in which we don't have enough evidence to know the answer. I don't know for sure if it's going to rain tomorrow or not. And yet, I don't need to know in order to decide what to do. If I don't know whether it's going to rain, then I should probably bring my umbrella. And bringing the umbrella and going out anyway, that's how I test my knowledge of the weather. And that's how we get the evidence that may eventually lead us to forming better beliefs in the future, so that we have no reason to fear lest a habit of conscientious inquiry should paralyze the actions of our daily life. So I think the idea is, you shouldn't believe things when you have insufficient evidence. You should figure out whether they might be probable or not, and act accordingly. And don't lose all faith, lose all ability to act just because you don't believe things. You should still be willing to act in the face of doubts and uncertainty. But you should know, when does your evidence actually support things, and when is it just a probability that you're operating in? He says, because it is not enough to say it is wrong to believe on unworthy evidence, without also saying what evidence is worthy. We shall now go on to inquire under what circumstances it is lawful to believe on the testimony of others. And then further, we shall inquire more generally when and why we may believe that which goes beyond our own experience, or even beyond the experience of mankind. So the rest of this paper is going to deal with issues of when is it that we are justified in believing things, particularly on the basis of testimony of other people when someone tells it to us, and also on the basis of making some observations here and now and using that to predict things about the future and other places. And I think some philosophers might agree with what he ends up with here, and some might disagree as to whether or not what he's arguing really is sufficient to answer the sorts of concerns he's raised so far. He's really been building up a very strong claim that we should never believe anything on insufficient evidence. And so now the question is, what is sufficient? In what cases then, let us ask in the first place, is the testimony of a man unworthy of belief? So that is, he's going to ask, when shouldn't we believe someone in order to figure out when we should? He may say that which is untrue, either knowingly or unknowingly. In the first case, that is, if he says that which is false knowingly, he is lying, and his moral character is to blame. In the second case, where he says what is false unknowingly, he is ignorant or is mistaken, and it is only his knowledge or his judgment which is in fault. I think given what he's said so far, we might think this is also a kind of moral failing, but it's a different moral failing. It's a moral failing of improper judgment rather than of improper speech. In order that we may have the right to accept his testimony as ground for believing what he says, we must have reasonable grounds for trusting his veracity, that he is really trying to speak the truth so far as he knows it, his knowledge that he has had opportunities of knowing the truth about this matter, and his judgment that he has made proper use of those opportunities in coming to the conclusion which he affirms. So that is, there's three things we need to check. Is this person being honest? Does this person have the ability to know? And is this person properly using their ability to know? If all three of those things are true, then it's appropriate to believe what someone says. However plain and obvious these reasons may be, so that no man of ordinary intelligence reflecting upon the matter could fail to arrive at them, it is nevertheless true that a great many persons do habitually disregard them in weighing testimony. Of the two questions equally important to the trustworthiness of a witness, is he dishonest and may he be mistaken? The majority of mankind are perfectly satisfied if one can, with some show of probability, be answered in the negative. That is, if we only have one of these questions, people often believe, but you really need both. You need to know if the person's being honest and if they have any reason to believe the thing that they're believing. The excellent moral character of a man is alleged as ground for accepting his statements about things which he cannot possibly have known. And so here he's going to go into a long example discussing Islam and the sorts of evidence that are presented for why we should believe in Islam. And he's going to use this as an argument for showing that honesty is not enough. You need to know honesty plus the ability of someone to know what they're saying. He's going to claim that even if Muhammad was the most honest person in history, some of his claims are the sorts of things that no human could ever have had good reason to believe. And so he's going to say we shouldn't trust Muhammad. A Mohammedan, for example, will tell us that the character of his prophet was so noble and majestic that it commands the reverence even of those who do not believe in his mission. So admirable was his moral teaching, so wisely put together the great social machine which he created, that his precepts have not only been accepted by a great portion of mankind, but have actually been obeyed. Here's a little bit more casual 19th century racism. His institutions have, on the one hand, rescued the Negro from savagery, and on the other hand, have taught civilization to the advancing West. And although the races which held the highest forms of his faith and most fully embodied his mind and thought have all been conquered and swept away by barbaric tribes, yet the history of the marvelous attainments remains as an imperishable glory to Islam. So here, I'm not sure that Clifford is necessarily endorsing all this, but he's saying this is a plausible claim. And but he's going to say, even if we believe all this, even if we believe that Muhammad was the greatest and most noble and majestic person that's ever lived, and even if we believe Islam has been a major civilizing force that has brought progress and moral value to a large fraction of humanity, he's going to say, even if we grant all that, there's still no reason to believe. He's going to say, are we to doubt the word of a man so great and so good? Can we suppose that this magnificent genius, this splendid moral hero, has lied to us about the most solemn and sacred matters? The testimony of Muhammad is clear, that there is but one God, and that he, Muhammad, is his prophet, that if we believe in him, we shall enjoy everlasting felicity, but that if we do not, we shall be damned. This testimony rests on the most awful of foundations, the revelation of heaven itself. For was he not visited by the angel Jibril as he fasted and prayed in his desert cave and allowed to enter into the blessed fields of paradise? Surely God is God and Muhammad is his prophet. What should we answer to this Muslim? First, no doubt, we should be tempted to take exception against his view of the character of the prophet and the uniformly beneficial influence of Islam. Before we could go with him altogether in these matters, it might seem that we should have to forget many terrible things of which we have heard or read. But even if we chose to grant him all these assumptions for the sake of argument, and because it is difficult both for the faithful and for infidels to discuss them fairly and without passion, still we should have something to say which takes away the ground of his belief, and therefore shows that it is wrong to entertain it. Namely this: the character of Muhammad is excellent evidence that he was honest and spoke the truth so far as he knew it, but it is no evidence at all that he knew what the truth was. What means could he have of knowing that the form which appeared to him to be the angel Gabriel was not a hallucination, and that his apparent visit to paradise was not a dream? Grant that he himself was fully persuaded and honestly believed that he had the guidance of heaven and was the vehicle of a supernatural revelation. How could he know that this strong conviction was not a mistake? Let us put ourselves in his place. We shall find that the more completely we endeavor to realize what passed through his mind, the more clearly we shall perceive that the prophet could have had no adequate ground for the belief in his own inspiration. It is most probable that he himself never doubted of the matter or thought of asking the question. But we are in the position of those to whom the question has been asked and who are bound to answer it. It is known to medical observers that solitude and want of food are powerful means of producing delusion and of fostering a tendency to mental disease. Let us suppose then that I, like Muhammad, go into desert places to fast and pray. What things can happen to me which will give me the right to believe that I'm divinely inspired? Suppose that I get information, apparently from a celestial visitor, which upon being tested is found to be correct. I cannot be sure in the first place that the celestial visitor is not a figment of my own mind, and that the information did not come to me unknown at the time to my consciousness through some subtle channel of sense. So that is, he's saying, even if you think you're visited by an angel and the angel tells you things that you don't think you could know, that you later check and find out are true, he still thinks it's more plausible that you yourself figured this out and then hallucinated an angel and made it up to explain to yourself how you have this knowledge, rather than that it was really an angel. And if that's right, then he thinks just because the apparent angel has told you one thing, that gives you no reason to believe anything else the apparent angel is telling you. He says, but if my visitor, this angel, were a real visitor, and for a long time gave me information which was found to be trustworthy, this would indeed be good ground for trusting him in the future, as to such matters as fall within human powers of verification. But it would not be ground for trusting his testimony as to any other matters. For although his tested character would justify me in believing that he spoke the truth so far as he knew, yet the same question would present itself. What ground is there for supposing that he, the angel, knows? Even if my supposed visitor had given me such information, subsequently verified by me, as proved him to have means of knowledge about verifiable matters far exceeding my own, this would not justify me in believing what he said about matters that are not at present capable of verification by man. It would be ground for interesting conjecture, and for the hope that, as the fruit of our patient inquiry, we might by and by attain to such a means of verification as should rightly turn conjecture into belief. For belief belongs to man and to the guidance of human affairs. No belief is real unless it guide our actions, and those very actions supply a test of its truth. So he's saying, if an angel comes to you and starts telling you things, the angel may tell you a lot of things that you can test and verify, and maybe if the angel tells you enough of those, you can then trust the angel for future things that you could verify. But if the angel also starts telling you things that are impossible to verify, then Clifford says that you should never believe. And by the end of this paper, he's going to say, this is not just a challenge to religion, this is also a challenge to science. If science tells you things that you could verify, then you should trust science. But if science claims to tell you things that no human could verify, then you shouldn't believe science any more than you should believe the angel. You should only ever believe people telling you things that could be verified, and only if you have reason to believe that they are trying to be honest and have used their abilities to verify it. But, it may be replied, the acceptance of Islam as a system is just that action which is prompted by belief in the mission of the prophet, and which will serve for a test of its truth. So the idea is, someone's going to say, let's grant that I can't check the individual things that Muhammad said or that the angel said to Muhammad. Nevertheless, can't we see that Islam is successful, and therefore believing Islam must be right? Is it possible to believe that a system which has succeeded so well is really founded upon a delusion? Not only have individual saints found joy and peace in believing and verified their spiritual experiences which are promised to the faithful, but nations also have been raised from savagery or barbarism to a higher social state. Surely we are at liberty to say that the belief has been acted upon and that it has been verified. It requires, however, but little consideration to show that what has really been verified is not at all the supernatural character of the prophet's mission, or the trustworthiness of his authority in matters which we ourselves cannot test, i.e. things about God and angels and paradise, but only his practical wisdom in certain very mundane things. The fact that believers have found joy and peace in believing gives us the right to say that this doctrine, Islam, is a comfortable doctrine and pleasant to the soul, but it does not give us the right to say that it is true. And the question which our conscience is always asking about that which we are tempted to believe is not, is it comfortable and pleasant, but is it true? that the prophet preached certain doctrines and predicted that spiritual comfort would be found in them proves only his sympathy with human nature and his knowledge of it, but it does not prove his superhuman knowledge of theology. And if we admit for the sake of argument, for it seems that we can do no more, that the progress made by Muslim nations in certain cases was really due to the system formed and sent forth into the world by Muhammad, we are not at liberty to conclude from this that he was inspired to declare the truth about things which we cannot verify. We are only at liberty to infer the excellence of his moral precepts, or the means which he devised for so working upon men as to get them obeyed, or of the social and political machinery which he set up. And it would require a great amount of careful examination into the history of those nations to determine which of these things had the greater share in the result. So that here again, it is the prophet's knowledge of human nature and his sympathy with it that are verified, not his divine inspiration or his knowledge of theology. So here he's saying, all the evidence that we can have is that we could maybe get good evidence that Muhammad is an honest man as far as he knows. We could get lots of evidence that Muhammad had some really interesting ideas about how to organize society, and that these ideas have been very successful in certain types of ways. But he says, none of that tells us anything about God or angels or the afterlife. He says all of that is the sort of thing which we cannot verify, and therefore we can't believe it, even if someone else tells it to us, because we have no reason to believe that that person could verify it. And so we have no reason to believe that even if that person is trying to be honest, that they haven't been deceived. And now he gives another reason to doubt religion. If there were only one prophet, indeed, it might well seem a difficult and even an ungracious task to decide upon what points we would trust him and on what we would doubt his authority. Seeing what help and furtherance all men have gained in all ages from those who saw more clearly, who felt more strongly, and who sought the truth with more single heart than their weaker brethren. But there is not only one prophet. And while the consent of many upon that which, as men, they had real means of knowing and did know, has endured to the end, and been honorably built into the great fabric of human knowledge, the diverse witness of some about that which they did not and could not know remains as a warning to us that to exaggerate the prophetic authority is to misuse it, and to dishonor those who have sought only to help and further us after their power. It is hardly in human nature that a man should quite accurately gauge the limits of his own insight, but it is the duty of those who profit by his work to consider carefully where he may have been carried beyond it. If we must needs embalm his possible errors along with his solid achievements and use his authority as an excuse for believing what he cannot have known, we make of his goodness an occasion to sin. So his point is here, no matter how good someone is at being a good person or at providing us with knowledge, no matter how much knowledge a person gives us, we shouldn't just blindly trust other things they say. If they tell us things that they can't verify, then we should just ignore that and just take the good. Nothing can justify us in trusting everything that a person says. We can only be justified in trusting the kinds of things that we could verify, even if we haven't done the verification, as long as we've done verification of enough of these things to get reason to believe that this person could have done the verification and has done so. To consider only one other such witness, the followers of the Buddha have at least as much right to appeal to individual and social experience in support of the authority of the Eastern Savior. The special mark of his religion, it is said, that in which it has never been surpassed, is the comfort and consolation which it gives to the sick and sorrowful, the tender sympathy with which it soothes and assuages all the natural griefs of men. And surely no triumph of social morality can be greater or nobler than that which has kept nearly half the human race from persecuting in the name of religion. There's some questions about that. Clifford wasn't aware of contemporary history in Sri Lanka or Myanmar or other places where Buddhist people have, in fact, persecuted minority religions. But it's true, Buddhism has done so much less than many other religions. If we are to trust the accounts of his early followers, he believed himself to have come upon earth with a divine and cosmic mission to set rolling the wheel of the law. Being a prince, he divested himself of his kingdom and of his free will became acquainted with misery, that he might learn how to meet and subdue it. Could such a man speak falsely about solemn things? And as for his knowledge, was he not a man miraculous with powers more than man's? He was born of woman without the help of man. He rose into the air and was transfigured before his kinsmen. At last, he went up bodily into heaven from the top of Adam's peak. Is not his word to be believed in when he testifies of heavenly things? A lot of the claims he's attributing here are only particular branches of Buddhism accept those. I believe Tibetan Buddhism accepts some of these, but I think many other branches of Buddhism do not. But if there were only he and no other with such claims, but there is Muhammad with his testimony, we cannot choose but listen to them both. The prophet tells us that there is one God, that we shall live forever in joy or misery according as we believe in the prophet or not, in the afterlife. But the Buddha says there is no God, and that we shall be annihilated, that is, we achieve nirvana by and by, if we are good enough. Both cannot be infallibly inspired. One or the other must have been the victim of a delusion and thought he knew that which he really didn't know. Who shall dare to say which? And how can we justify ourselves in believing that the other was not also deluded? He's not giving us Christian examples here, but I think the implication is very strong. He wants us to say, all of these religions, to the extent that they are saying things that we could verify, whether those things are historical facts or facts about how society works or facts about morality, those things we can believe. But if they're making claims about what lies beyond human verification, what happens in the afterlife, what happened before life on Earth, in those things, he claims, no one could ever have good reason to believe that they know about them. And so we shouldn't trust anyone who claims they do. We are led then to these judgments following. The goodness and greatness of a man do not justify us in accepting a belief upon the warrant of his authority, unless there are reasonable grounds for supposing that he knew the truth of what he was saying. And there can be no grounds for supposing that a man knows that which we, without ceasing to be men, could not be supposed to verify. And so here he's giving the same argument considering science. If a chemist tells me, who am no chemist, that a certain substance can be made by putting together other substances in certain proportions and subjecting them to a known process, I'm quite justified in believing this upon his authority, unless I know anything against his character or his judgment. For his professional training is one which tends to encourage veracity and the honest pursuit of truth, and to produce a dislike of hasty conclusions and slovenly investigation. And I have reasonable ground for supposing that he knows the truth of what he is saying. For although I am no chemist, I can be made to understand so much of the methods and processes of the science as makes it conceivable to me that, without ceasing to be man, I might verify the statement. So maybe I don't really know how to run lab equipment, but I've seen lab equipment and I've seen other people use it and I've seen other people learn to use it. And so I believe I could be taught to use it. And therefore, I trust that they could be taught to use it too. And so therefore that they could be able to verify the sorts of claims that they're verifying. I may never actually verify it or even see any experiment which goes towards verifying it. But still, I have quite reason enough to justify me in believing that the verification is within the reach of human appliances and powers, and in particular that it has been actually performed by my informant, or presumably by someone who's informed them. His result, the belief to which he has been led by his inquiries, is valid not only for himself but for others. It is watched and tested by those who are working in the same ground, and who know that no greater service can be rendered to science than the purification of accepted results from the errors which may have crept into them. It is in this way that the result becomes common property, a right object of belief, which is a social affair and matter of public business. Thus, it is to be observed that his authority, the chemist's authority, is valid because there are those who question it and verify it. That it is precisely this process of examining and purifying that keeps alive among investigators the love of that which shall stand all possible tests, the sense of public responsibility as of those whose work, if well done, shall remain as the enduring heritage of mankind. But If my chemist tells me that an atom of oxygen has existed unaltered in weight and rate of vibration throughout all time, I have no right to believe this on his authority, for it is a thing which he cannot know without ceasing to be man. So that is, science tells us if you mix carbon and oxygen in particular proportions and heat them in particular ways, it can turn into carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide. I believe this because I can verify this. Science also tells us that the laws of physics and the laws of chemistry are eternal and unchanging and have been the same for all of the history of the universe. And this, Clifford says, we have no good reason to believe, because it's impossible to verify that. The chemist may quite honestly believe that this statement is a fair inference from his experiments, but in that case, his judgment is at fault. A very simple consideration of the character of experiments would show him that they never can lead to results of such a kind, that being themselves only approximate and limited, they cannot give us knowledge which is exact and universal. No eminence of character and genius can give a man authority enough to justify us in believing him when he makes statements implying exact or universal knowledge. So just as he told us, the religious figures, we can believe their morality, we can believe their social theories, but we shouldn't believe their metaphysics. For the scientific figures, he says, we should believe their experiments and their procedures, but not their claims about science being eternal and unchanging. Again, an Arctic explorer may tell us that in a given latitude and longitude, he's experienced such and such a degree of cold, that the sea was of such a depth, and the ice of such a character. We should be quite right to believe him in the absence of any stain upon his veracity. It is conceivable that we might, without ceasing to be men, go there and verify his statement. It can be tested by the witness of his companions, and there is adequate ground for supposing that he knows the truth of what he's saying. But if an old whaler tells us that the ice is 300 feet thick all the way up to the pole, we shall not be justified in believing him. For although the statement may be capable of verification by man, I think these days we probably could check that sort of thing with radar or something like that. In 1887 or 1879, it probably wasn't possible for anyone to check that, but he recognized it could be verifiable, but it was not capable of verification by him with any means and appliances which he has possessed. And he must have persuaded himself of the truth of it by some means which does not attach any credit to his testimony. Even if, therefore, the matter affirmed is within the reach of human knowledge, we have no right to accept it upon authority unless it is within the reach of our informant's knowledge. What shall we say of that authority, more venerable and august than any individual witness, the time-honored tradition of the human race? I think here he's talking about common sense, superstition, tradition, all of these things. An atmosphere of beliefs and conceptions has been formed by the labors and struggles of our forefathers, which enables us to breathe amid the various and complex circumstances of our life. It is around and about us and within us. We cannot think except in the forms and processes of thought which it supplies, it being, again, common sense or tradition or whatever common knowledge is. Is it possible to doubt and test it? And if possible, is it right? We shall find reason to answer that it is not only possible and right, but our bounden duty, that the main purpose of the tradition itself is to supply us with the means of asking questions, of testing and inquiring into things. That if we misuse it and take it as a collection of cut and dried statements to be accepted without further inquiry, we are not only injuring ourselves here, but by refusing to do our part towards the building up of the fabric which shall be inherited by our children, we are tending to cut ourselves off and our race from the human line. So that is, he's saying, if you're going to believe anything that comes from your tradition, it should be because your tradition tells you how to ask the questions and how to figure out their answers and verify them, not because it's the traditional answer. Let us first take care to distinguish a kind of tradition which especially requires to be examined and called in question because it especially shrinks from inquiry. Suppose that a medicine man in Central Africa tells his tribe that a certain powerful medicine in his tent, medicine being a word for magic or ritual, will be propitiated if they kill their cattle, and the tribe believe him. Whether the medicine was propitiated or not, there are no means of verifying, but the cattle are gone. Still, the belief may be kept up in the tribe that propitiation has been effected in this way. And in a later generation, it will be all the easier for another medicine man to persuade them to a similar act. Here, the only reason for belief is that everybody has believed the thing for so long that it must be true. And yet, the belief was founded on fraud and has been propagated by credulity. That man will undoubtedly do right and be a friend of men, who shall call it in question and see that there is no evidence for it, help his neighbors to see as he does, and even, if need be, go into the holy tent and break the medicine. I'm not sure if he's telling people to go into the cathedrals and break the altars, but it certainly sounds like it. The rule which should guide us in such cases is simple and obvious enough, that the aggregate testimony of our neighbors is subject to the same conditions as the testimony of any one of them. Namely, we have no right to believe a thing to be true just because everybody says so, unless there are good grounds for believing that some one person at least has the means of knowing what is true and is speaking the truth so far as he knows it. However many nations and generations of men are brought into the witness box, they cannot testify to anything which they do not know. Every man who has accepted the statement from somebody else without himself testifying and verifying it is out of court. His word is worth nothing at all. And when we get back at last to the true birth and beginning of the statement, two serious questions must be disposed of in regard to him who first made it. Was he mistaken in thinking that he knew about this matter, or was he lying? The last question is unfortunately a very actual and practical one, even to us at this day and in this country. We have no occasion to go to La Salette or to Central Africa or to Lourdes for examples of immoral and debasing superstition. Here he's saying, it's not just those crazy Catholics and savages, it's also us supposedly civilized British people that have superstition and lies. It is only too possible for a child to grow up in London, surrounded by an atmosphere of beliefs fit only for the savage, which have in our own time been founded in fraud and propagated by credulity. Laying aside, then, such tradition as is handed on without testing by successive generations, let us consider that which is truly built up out of the common experience of mankind. This great fabric is for the guidance of our thoughts, and through them of our actions, both in the moral and in the material world. In the moral world, for example, it gives us the conceptions of right in general, of justice, of truth, of beneficence, and the like. These are given as conceptions, not as statements and propositions. They answer to certain definite instincts which are certainly within us, however they came there. That it is right to be beneficent is a matter of immediate personal experience. For when a man retires within himself and there finds something wider and more lasting than his solitary personality, which says, I want to do right, as well as I want to do good to man, he can verify by direct observation that one instinct is founded upon and agrees fully with the other. And it is his duty to so verify this and all similar statements. So that is, he says, consider the idea, I want to do the right thing, and consider the idea, I want to do things that are good for people. If you think about it, you recognize within yourself that those two things will go together. That's his claim. And he claims the fact that we can all recognize that within ourselves, he claims that is evidence for this belief. And that's the thing that justifies us in this moral belief. The tradition says also at a definite place and time that such and such actions are just or true or beneficent. For all such rules, a further inquiry is necessary, since they are sometimes established by an authority other than that of the moral sense founded on experience. And so here he's saying, just because people tell you that a certain type of act is good doesn't mean that it is good. You have to come back to this definition of good, that good means helping people. And so he says, until recently, the moral tradition of our own country, and indeed of all Europe, taught that it was beneficent, that is, it did good, to give money indiscriminately to beggars. But the questioning of this rule and investigation into it led men to see that true beneficence is that which helps a man to do the work which he is most fitted for, not that which keeps and encourages him in idleness, and that to neglect this distinction in the present is to prepare pauperism and misery for the future. Now, I think there's a lot more to be said about this particular matter. When is it that giving people money helps them? When is it that telling them to get a job helps them? But I think his point is, we shouldn't just accept an answer to this. We should think about it and figure out what investigations we need to carry out to figure out what would actually lead to good outcomes. And that's what it is to be beneficent, and that's what it is to be right. By this testing and discussion, not only has practice been purified and made more beneficent, but the very conception of beneficence has been made wider and wiser. Now here, the great social heirloom consists of two parts: the instinct of beneficence, which makes a certain side of our nature, when predominant, wish to do good to men, and the intellectual conception of beneficence, which we can compare with any proposed course of conduct and ask, is this beneficent or not? That is, he's saying we have to both have the moral desire to do good and the intellectual practice of questioning whether what we're doing is actually doing good. And if we continue to do that, then we'll gradually realize, oh, that previous generation was ignoring an entire swath of the population. We have to do good for them too, not just for the people that they were thinking about. And so we can improve our moral knowledge by use of our reason, he says. By the continual asking and answering of such questions, the conception of beneficence grows in breadth and distinctness, and the instinct becomes strengthened and purified. It appears then that the great use of the conception, the intellectual part of the heirloom, is to enable us to ask questions, that it grows and is kept straight by means of these questions. And if we do not use it for that purpose, we shall gradually lose it altogether and be left with a mere code of regulations, which cannot rightly be called morality at all. So that is, he's saying, morality is about constantly questioning, are these sorts of acts really the ones that are leading to good? And if so, the questioning is what's going to lead us to get to the rightness, not just following some rules blindly. Such considerations apply even more obviously and clearly, if possible, to the store of beliefs and conceptions which our fathers have amassed for us in respect to the material world. We are ready to laugh at the rule of thumb of the Australian, here he's talking about an indigenous person from Australia, who continues to tie his hatchet to the side of the handle, although the Birmingham fitter has made a hole on purpose for him to put the handle in. His people have tied up hatchets so for ages. Who is he that he should set himself up against their wisdom? He has sunk so low that he cannot do what some of them must have done in the far distant past: call in question an established usage and invent or learn something better. Here again, we see a bit more casual racism. He's assuming that Aboriginal people never question anything and never invent new ideas, even though maybe once in the past people of them had. Yet here, in the dim beginning of knowledge, where science and art are one, we find only the same simple rule, which applies to the highest and deepest growths of that cosmic tree, to its loftiest flower-tipped branches, as well as to the profoundest of its hidden roots. The rule, namely, that what is stored up and handed down to us is rightly used by those who act as the makers acted when they stored it up. Those who use it to ask further questions, to examine, to investigate, who try honestly and solemnly to find out what is the right way of looking at things and of dealing with them. A question rightly asked is already half answered, said Jacobi. Jacobi's a mathematician here. We may add that the method of solution is the other half of the answer. The actual result counts for nothing by the side of these two. That is the point. The point he's making is what really matters is that you know how to ask the right questions and that you know how to investigate them. If you got those two, that's better than knowing the answer. For an example, let us go to the telegraph, where theory and practice, grown each to years of discretion, are marvelously wedded for the fruitful service of men. Ohm, the physicist, found that the strength of an electric current is directly proportional to the strength of the battery which produces it, and inversely is the length of the wire along which it has to travel. This is called Ohm's law. But the result, regarded as a statement to be believed, is not the valuable part of it. The first half of the question, what relation holds good between these quantities? So put, the question involves already the conception of strength of current and of strength of battery as quantities to be measured and compared. It hints clearly that these are the things to be attended to in the study of electric currents. The second half is the method of investigation. how to measure these quantities, what instruments are required for the experiment, and how are they to be used. The student who begins to learn about electricity is not asked to believe in Ohm's law. He is made to understand the question. He is placed before the apparatus and he is taught to verify it. He learns to do things, not to think he knows things, to use instruments and to ask questions, not to accept a traditional statement. The question which required a genius to ask it rightly is answered by a tyro. Tyro, I think, is just a young child. If Ohm's law were suddenly lost and forgotten by all men, while the question and the method of solution remained, the result could be rediscovered in an hour. But the result by itself, if known to a people who could not comprehend the value of the question or the means of solving it, would be like a watch in the hands of a savage who could not wind it up, or an iron steamship worked by Spanish engineers. A little bit more racism here, I guess. In regard, then, to the sacred tradition of humanity, we learn that it consists not in propositions or statements which are to be accepted and believed on the authority of the tradition, but in questions rightly asked, in conceptions which enable us to ask further questions, and in methods of answering questions. The value of all these things depends on their being tested day by day. The very sacredness of the precious deposit imposes upon us the duty and the responsibility of testing it, of purifying it, enlarging it to the utmost of our power. He who makes use of its results to stifle his own doubts or to hamper the inquiry of others is guilty of a sacrilege which centuries shall never be able to blot out. When the labors and questionings of honest and brave men shall have built up the fabric of known truth to a glory which we in this generation can neither hope for nor imagine, in that pure and holy temple he shall have no part or lot, but his name and his works shall be cast out into the darkness of oblivion forever. Again, some flowery language. He's saying the important part of tradition is that our tradition can teach us the questions to ask and the methods of verifying the answers. The answers themselves are never the important part of the tradition. Maybe it's helpful, maybe it saves you a few minutes of work, but he thinks having the right questions and having the tools to answer them, that's what matters. And you should always investigate if you can, or find someone who has investigated and believe and convince them, make them convince you that they do know how to investigate and they have done so. That's when you have the right to believe things. And no matter how much someone convinces you that they've investigated a lot of questions and believed a lot of things, if they make some further claims that you think they couldn't possibly have investigated, you shouldn't believe those claims. Section 3, the limits of inference. I tend to worry that in this last section, he takes back some of what he said earlier, and there's a question how it all fits together. The question in what cases we may believe that which goes beyond our experience is a very large and delicate one, extending to the whole range of scientific method and requiring a considerable increase in the application of it before it can be answered with anything approaching to completeness. So here he's saying, why am I ever justified in believing that future electrical currents will behave the same way that past ones did? That's believing something that goes beyond my experience. And he's claiming to give a justification of this. Why is it that we can believe about the future, even though none of us has any way of verifying the future? Why should I believe that the sun will continue to shine tomorrow? Why should I believe that fire will continue to burn tomorrow? I haven't observed all that, and it's impossible for me or anyone else to have verified that the future will be like the past. But one rule, lying on the threshold of the subject, of extreme simplicity and very vast practical importance, may here be touched upon and shortly laid down. A little reflection will show us that every belief, even the simplest and most fundamental, goes beyond experience, when regarded as a guide to our actions. A burnt child dreads the fire because it believes that the fire will burn today, just as it did yesterday. But this belief goes beyond experience and assumes that the unknown fire of today is like the known fire of yesterday. Even the belief that the child was burnt yesterday goes beyond present experience, which contains only the memory of a burning and not the burning itself. It assumes, therefore, that this memory is trustworthy, although we know that a memory may often be mistaken. But if it is to be used as a guide to action, as a hint of what the future is to be, it must assume something about that future, namely, that it will be consistent with the supposition that the burning really did take place yesterday, which is going beyond experience. Even the fundamental I am, which cannot be doubted, that is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. The fact that I exist is the one thing Descartes thinks we can't doubt. Because if I didn't exist, I couldn't be doing the doubting. But even this fundamental I am is no guide to action until it takes to itself I shall be. That is, it's not just that I exist now. How do I know I will continue to exist a second from now? I need to believe that if I'm going to act in any way. And as Clifford said early on, belief is always about action. So belief always does involve some belief in the untested and in fact untestable, because it's about the future. The future always keeps getting farther away. The question is not, therefore, may we believe what goes beyond experience? For this is involved in the very nature of belief. But how far and in what manner may we add to our experience in forming our beliefs? And an answer of utter simplicity and universality is suggested by the example we have taken. A burnt child dreads the fire. We may go beyond experience by assuming that what we do not know is like what we do know. Or in other words, we may add to our experience on the assumption of a uniformity in nature. What this uniformity precisely is, how we grow in the knowledge of it from generation to generation, these are questions which, for the present, we lay aside, being content to examine two instances which may serve to make plainer the nature of the rule. From certain observations made with a spectroscope, we infer the existence of hydrogen in the sun. By looking into the spectroscope when the sun is shining on its slit, we see certain definite bright lines. And the experiments made upon bodies on the Earth have taught us that when these bright lines are seen, hydrogen is the source of them. So a spectroscope is something that when light shines on it, it splits the light into all its colors. And one thing that scientists discovered in the 19th century is that many lights, particularly flames and other glowing objects from heat, have, when you split the light, they don't just have every color equally. There are certain bright lines in them. And which lines are bright, there's a pattern based on what element the substance is made out of. Experiments made upon bodies on the Earth have taught us that when these bright lines are seen, when these ones are seen, hydrogen is the source of them. There's other lines for carbon and for oxygen and so on. We assume then that the unknown bright lines in the sun are like the known bright lines of the laboratory, and that hydrogen in the sun behaves as hydrogen under similar circumstances would behave on Earth. So this is, how is it that we can believe things about what the sun is made of? Why is it that this test of spectroscopy tells us that the sun is made out of hydrogen? Aren't we assuming something that we could never verify? Are we not trusting our spectroscope too much? Surely, having found it to be trustworthy for terrestrial substances, where its statements can be verified by man, we are justified in accepting its testimony in other like cases, but not when it gives us information about things in the sun, where its testimony cannot be directly verified by man. At least that's what Clifford would have said a few pages earlier, I think. Certainly, we want to know a little more before this inference can be justified. And fortunately, we do know this. The spectroscope testifies to exactly the same thing in the two cases, namely that light vibrations of a certain rate are being sent through it. So he says it's not just that the spectroscope is telling us about what the pattern of light is. It's telling us something much more physical. It's about vibrations and of a certain rate. Its construction is such that if it were wrong about this in one case, it would be wrong in the other. When we come to look into the matter, we find that we have really assumed the matter of the sun to be like the matter of the Earth, made up of a certain number of distinct substances, and that each of these, when very hot, has a distinct rate of vibration, by which it may be recognized and singled out from the rest. But this is the kind of assumption which we are justified in using when we add to our experience. It is an assumption of uniformity in nature and can only be checked by comparison with many similar assumptions which we have to make in other such cases. I do worry about this because this is almost precisely the thing that he says we shouldn't trust a chemist on. The chemist tells us that oxygen always vibrates at the same rate and has for all of history. He said we shouldn't believe the chemist telling us about the distant past. Why should we believe the chemist telling us about the sun? I'm not totally sure I understand, but I think this is the sort of question that he has to deal with. Is this a true belief of the existence of hydrogen in the sun? Is this a true belief? Can it help in the right guidance of human action? Certainly not if it's accepted on unworthy grounds and without some understanding of the process by which it is got at. But when this process is taken in as the ground of the belief, it becomes a very serious and practical matter. For if there is no hydrogen in the sun, the spectroscope, that is to say the measurement of rates of vibration, must be an uncertain guide in recognizing different substances. And consequently, it ought not to be used in chemical analysis, in assaying, for example, to the great saving of time, trouble, and money. Whereas the acceptance of the spectroscopic method as trustworthy has enriched us not only with new metals, which is a great thing, but with new process of investigation, which is vastly greater. So here he's saying, spectroscopy enabled us not just to make claims about the sun, but also to detect new elements here on Earth. And the fact that it gave us a new method of testing things, that's what he thinks gives us reason to trust it in new cases. But I think he's also connected to the point that he thinks belief is always connected to action. And to the extent that we believe there's hydrogen in the sun, that only means something if there's some action that depends on hydrogen being in the sun. And since the sun is so far away, maybe that action is really only about spectroscopes. Maybe someday we develop some new method of interacting with the sun. We certainly have in the century and a half since Clifford was writing. And now we test the belief further. And I think he's saying, anytime we develop new means of making predictions or testing things, we should do them and not just accept the old ones. But as far as we only have certain methods of verification, we can trust things as long as we take them to only be talking about that method of verification. For another example, let us consider the way in which we infer the truth of an historical event, say the siege of Syracuse in the Peloponnesian War. Our experience is that manuscripts exist, which are said to be, and which call themselves, manuscripts of the history of Thucydides. That in other manuscripts, stated to be by later historians, he is described as living during the time of the war, and that books, supposed to date from the revival of learning, tell us how these manuscripts had been preserved and were then acquired. I think a little bit of this history is bad. I don't think there was a clear loss of the books until the Renaissance and the revival. I think the tradition was actually preserved throughout, but nevertheless, his point is the same. The books claim to be by Thucydides. Later authors claim that Thucydides lived at the time of the war. We find that men do not, as a rule, forge books and histories without a special motive. We assume that in this respect, men in the past were like men in the present, and we observe that in this case, no special motive was present. It probably matters that Thucydides is just talking about a distant war, and that Thucydides is not talking about his own performance in the war. So there's no particular reason to think that Thucydides was making this up, and he lived at the time, so he probably had access to knowledge. Because our knowledge of this uniformity, so that is, we add to our experience on the assumption of a uniformity in the characters of men. That is, we assume that all people are like this. They're not going to just make things up unless they have a reason to. Because our knowledge of this uniformity is far less complete and exact than our knowledge of that which obtains in physics, inferences of the historical kind are more precarious and less exact than inferences in many other sciences. But if there is any special reason to suspect the character of the persons who wrote or transmitted certain books, the case becomes altered. If a group of documents give internal evidence that they were produced among the people who forged books in the names of others, and who in describing events suppressed those things which did not suit them, while they amplified such as did suit them, who not only committed these crimes, but gloried in them as proofs of humility and zeal, then we must say that upon such documents, no true historical inference can be founded, but only unsatisfactory conjecture. And I think here he's thinking about religious documents. We may then add to our experience on the assumption of a uniformity in nature. We may fill in our picture of what is and has been, as experience gives it to us, in such a way as to make the whole consistent with this uniformity. and practically demonstrative inference, that which gives us a right to believe in the result of it, is a clear showing that in no other way than by the truth of this result can the uniformity of nature be saved. No evidence, therefore, can justify us in believing the truth of a statement which is contrary to or outside of the uniformity of nature. If our experience is such that it cannot be filled up consistently with uniformity, all we have a right to conclude is that there is something wrong somewhere, but the possibility of inference is taken away. We must rest in our experience and not go beyond it at all. And that is, if we make a lot of observations and we discover that all the laws that we thought we knew are broken, then if we don't have any new uniformities, then we just have to be skeptical and believe only what we've seen with our own eyes. But if there is a pattern of uniformity, then we're allowed to use that to believe things that go beyond what we can see. If an event really happened, which was not part of the uniformity of nature, it would have two properties. No evidence could give the right to believe it to any except those whose actual experience it was, and no inference worthy of belief could be founded upon it at all. So these two sentences, this is a summary of an argument by David Hume that is arguing that we should never believe in miracles. If there really was something that was a miracle meaning a violation of the laws of nature, then there's no evidence that could ever give us a reason to believe that there is a violation of a real law of nature. It would have to be a discovery of a deeper law of nature. It couldn't be just a belief that a law of nature was violated. And no inference could be founded upon a belief in a miracle. So Hume is arguing that miracles cannot be the basis of religious belief, and Clifford is repeating that here. Are we then bound to believe that nature is absolutely and universally uniform? Certainly not. We have no right to believe anything of this kind. The rule only tells us that in forming beliefs which do go beyond our experience, we may make the assumption that nature is practically uniform so far as we are concerned. Within the range of human action and verification, we may form, by help of this assumption, actual beliefs. Beyond it, only those hypotheses which serve for the more accurate asking of questions. To sum up, we may believe what goes beyond our experience only when it is inferred from that experience by the assumption that what we do not know is like what we know. We may believe the statement of another person when there is reasonable ground for supposing that he knows the matter of which he speaks and that he is speaking the truth so far as he knows it. It is wrong in all cases to believe on insufficient evidence, and where it is presumption to doubt and to investigate, it is worse than presumption to believe. Okay, so he's giving us a very strict set of rules and telling us we can meet these rules. And I think he's trying to call into question all sorts of religious and traditional beliefs, and also a lot of science. He's telling us that we should only believe that which we have a right to believe, and that this is a real right. It's an ethical question, whether you believe in line with the evidence. I personally think there's all sorts of ways in which he's making claims that are way too strong to properly be fully justified, but I think it's still worth thinking about the arguments he's giving us and seeing what would have to be the case to support this, or if we disagree with some of his premises, how much of his argument do we still accept? I think most of us still think that if you form a belief on insufficient evidence and then act on it and then harm people, something bad was done. And the question is, how far can we generalize that? And is it really that every single belief needs to be held to the same standards and that all of humanity must always be investigating and questioning everything? Or can we say something about which ones are more important and when these habits are more important to develop?